Amelia, we are living in a golden age of X-Men. I have been saying this since last year with the return of X-Men, the animated series in X-Men 97, with Deadpool and Wolverine making over $1 billion at the box office. The plethora of Marvel legends that have come in. The only thing that has been lacking in recent times has been the comic books. And that's really unfortunate because, it's funny. I was talking about this the other day with a friend where I love the X Men video games. I love the Marvel Legends. I love the animated series. I love X Men Evolution. I love X Men Anime. I love it all. However, my fundamental love for the X Men stem from the comic books. And it could be because I was in fourth grade when I started reading comic books. I mean, I don't think fourth grade is pretty accurate, a little bit before that, but I mean, seriously, reading comic books, probably fourth grade. And I just think it is one of the most incredible, powerful ways to tell a story. The graphic novel medium for me is perfect. I think you get so much out of a graphic novel, a good graphic novel. You get kick ass art. Again, I think I've said this before. When I held that Fleer Ultra of Rogue, so it's a card, not the comic book art, but the art. When I held that Fleer Ultra of Rogue, my mind was blown. Not only because I was so intrigued by the character, but because I hadn't seen art like that. Right? All I knew was the Mona Lisa in fourth grade. Picasso, right? All great works of art, not bashing any of that. But there was just something so modern, so relevant to seeing Rogue in that leather jacket with the boulder behind her, looking like she was ready to punch the person looking at the card. It was incredible. It was powerful. It was sexy. It was illustrated so well. It piqued my curiosity. And that's how I felt going into the comic books. I say this all the time. The Howard Mackie Lee Weeks Gambit. You have to understand what it was like for a kid who grew up on Calle Ocho, Kendall, in Miami in the 90s, who had never left Miami. I did not leave South Florida. I mean, Orlando. I went to Orlando and Captiva, Sanibel Island. So let's say Central Florida. But I did not leave South to Central Florida until I was 19 years old. I'm saying this because when you sit down, you're a kid who's never known anything beyond your surroundings, and you sit down and you open up that Gambit miniseries by Howard Mackie with art by Lee Weeks, and you see New Orleans, you're blown away. You're like, there's an entire world out there. And that is how I feel that every good comic book should do. And now taking that a step further, the X-Men to me are probably one of the greatest stories our society has ever told. It's been going since the 60s, but you have a group of teenagers with mutant abilities, and they have to protect a world that fears and hates them. And throughout the decades, those stories change. The symbolism behind the stories change, but some things remain constant. They are heroes. They rise above evil. The franchise is politically charged. The franchise has big sci-fi elements. You can go from the Mutant Registration Act to Age of Apocalypse to Onslaught, where their professor has betrayed them. You can go to Messiah Complex, where a baby is born for the first time since M Day, and this is the hope that the mutant species would not go away. You could go to Captain America on the wrong side of history here, fighting Cyclops because the Phoenix is coming. It is such a great franchise. And you go to Krakoa, where the mutants are like, you know what? We're no longer playing by humanity's rules. We have our own autonomy. We have our own island. It is such a great franchise. So if I'm ever hard on the comics, it's because that's the bar I have set for the X-Men. And it could be unfair and it could be irrational. And you can say that, not everything has to be good all the time. And I agree. But the X-Men comics haven't been good for a while. And it has really bothered me. However, I'm here to say that I feel with Age of Revelation, it's a step in the right direction. I feel that Jed McKay really has thought out the story. And I know I was talking to someone on DMs the other day and they were saying, "Oh, I can't believe it's another time traveling story." And I'm like, yeah, it's a trope of the franchise without doubt, but this is why we love the X-Men. We love these time traveling stories. They exist for these reasons. And one of the things that I think you have to do with a good time traveling story is it's less focused on like your baseline plot, right? Where there's a dystopian future, somehow you have to cross time to fix it. In the end, everything gets back to normal. Years from now, people won't remember the story. That's the baseline, is what I'm saying. What has made these stories so great in the past is that it's focus on characters and situations and built up, right? And we've kind of talked about this the other day on the Instagram page when Lalandra came back. And she comes back and she's here like, "Hey, Gladiator. Hey, Deathbird." And that's it. And listen, we're comic book readers. The dead don't always stay dead. Nothing ever stays buried. And that's fine. It's perfectly fine. However, we as readers keep buying into this cycle of death and rebirth because we want those character moments, those reunions. And so it's the same thing with these time traveling stories. Yes, the X-Men in the present are working so hard towards something, and yet there's that dystopian timeline just hovering over them. The future is bleak. And I know in story they make references and jokes. They're like, haha, another dystopian future, but that's fine. I'm always here for a meta joke, but I think we cannot take away from the fact that the X-Men are always battling not only against humanity or Apocalypse or the Brood or the Shi'ar, but they're battling against time. They have to figure things out. If not, everything they have done is futile. And that's a beautiful moral for the reader to take. So when it comes into Age of Revelations, I will say here, I'm going to put at the top of this episode because I do like this quite a bit, but I'm going to put it right here. I do think to myself, why does this story matter? Right? When you think of Days of Future Past, for example, this is Kitty starting off on the team. She's wide eyed. We hope you survived the experience, Kitty. And then her future self, Kate, body swaps with her and is like, "Hey, this little girl who just joined the team, she's somewhere else now. I'm Kate. I've been on this team for decades, and I'm coming to warn us from a terrible impending future. There's so much hope in the present, but the future is bleak, and we got to solve this." And that really sets up Kitty so quickly for the reader. Age of Apocalypse, the build up for it. Legion wanted to do something for his father. So he goes back in time to stop Magneto, only to learn that his father would jump in front of a Cyblade to save Magneto, his worst enemy. But what Legion didn't realize is that it's his best friend. It's incredible. Even Here Comes Tomorrow, which we'll get into it when we're talking about Age of Revelation. Jed McKay is very inspired by Here Comes Tomorrow. And this is going to be my main criticism here, which is in Here Comes Tomorrow, it was not a company wide event or, IP wide event, right? There weren't a zillion books. It was just a couple of issues at the end of Morrison's New X-Men where it was a dystopian future. So everything we had seen in the present kind of played out in the future. I know that's kind of a polarizing thing amongst X-Men fans who have read the run, who wish that we did not get that future story, but it was very cleverly done on Morrison's end, and it does happen to be one of my favorite arcs of X-Men. But Days of Future Past, Age of Apocalypse, and Here Comes Tomorrow all sourced what was happening in the books, and they were, well, I don't want to say Age of Apocalypse was contained, but they were contained to those events. It's not the 20 book crossover event that Age of Revelation is. Is that fair to say? Again, I know I don't think Days in Future Past and Here Comes Tomorrow is applicable, but for Age of Apocalypse, yeah, we had a lot of tie-in books, but they, within reason, there was tie-in books. But so Here Comes Tomorrow deals with everything that happened in the new X-Men run, and similarly, Age of Revelation, I believe, is something that Jed McKay's run is building towards. And it should just be contained to that. And in fairness, you only have to buy the main issues, which are just like a handful of issues. But I think one of the things that I'm struggling with going into this is like kind of like, why does it exist? And there has been good setup for it. I want to give props to the X Office for it. We started the story off in Heir of Apocalypse, and it continued through to Age of Revelation issue 0, and in last week's X-Men 22, and now this week's Age of Revelation Overture. And just to give some backstory so everyone is sort of on the same page for it, Heir of Apocalypse dealt with Apocalypse realizing that he is not going to stay on Earth, and he has to go to Araco to care for those mutants, so he needs to appoint an heir. And he grabs a bunch of mutants, and it's kind of like a tourney mode, and the person left standing is Doug Cypher, and he becomes Revelation. And we don't really hear anything from Doug until he appears in Age of Revelation issue 0, where we find out the Cyclops, leading his team post-Krakoa, welcomed him into the team. And it was that moment that they shook hands that the universe broke. And we now have 10 years later, although it says X, it's 10 years later. They confirm it in today's issue. I'm sure they've confirmed it elsewhere, but here they specifically say 10 years. 10 years, which is a nice trope in the franchise, right? It started off with 10 of Swords and Hour of 10, like, House of X. You kind of interchange the 10 and the X, and Weapon X as well, of course. So one of the things here is that that's very much Here Comes Tomorrow coded, and we know McKay is very much inspired by the Morrison run, in which there's a single moment the universe broke. It was a bit more poetic in Here Comes Tomorrow. In Here Comes Tomorrow, the universe broke exactly when Cyclops walks away from Emma at Jean's grave, and he says, I don't want to do the school anymore. There's heroes, there's villains, and villains always want to kill us heroes. I'm done. And Emma's like shocked when he leaves. And so when Jean ascends into the White Hot Room, he pushes Scott to be with Emma. So instead of walking away from Emma at her grave, Cyclops says, I do want to continue the X-Men with you, Emma. And he kisses Emma. And the universe is saved. Here, it's just a handshake with Doug Ramsey. But the universe breaks there. And after being welcomed onto Cyclops' X-Men with open arms, for lack of a better term, Revelation sets out to make the impossible task of Apocalypse's dream, which is creating a world where the fittest survive. And this is kind of like an interesting notion because Apocalypse and the fittest for survival really was absent during the Krakoan age, where they really pivoted with Apocalypse to try to make him more of a Thanos character, right? Just a little bit more sympathetic. We got even more backstory on Apocalypse, that he was married before, that there's a whole generation of mutants that he knew. They're now all on Araco. So, it's nice to go back to basics with Apocalypse. I think Apocalypse at his core can be a very terrifying villain. But Doug commands the Earth with his god voice, reshaping it as a utopian haven for mutant kind. And that's something that we talk about in today's issue of Age of Revelation Overture. And it's a mutant homeland built on an insidious lie spreading across the planet and wiping out humanity until it becomes a mutant home world. Now, I think this is really great. I mean, there are a couple of things here that don't really add up to me quite yet. And this is because this is a curse of being a long-term reader here. One of the things that they've really done with Doug is show that he has a voice of God and that he can control mutants and living species, excuse me, on a cellular level. And it was kind of established already in Necrotia, where when Doug was resurrected, his ability to learn every language translated into looking at a building and understanding what the architect was trying to do, because architecture is a kind of language, right? When he attacked Magma and Magma wouldn't forgive him, he had created a language only for Magma to understand, and that's how Magma forgave him. So this idea that Doug has a voice of God just seems a bit more futile. In fairness, it hasn't been used. God, I'm going to sound so old in like 15, 20 years. So I get it. It's not how long ago Necrotia was. Oh gosh, it was like another life. But I, it feels a little redundant to have to say voice of God, but that's fine. So what we know here is that with Doug Ramsey's rise to power because of his voice of God, there is a mutant run territory which is stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and it's ruled by the Heir of Apocalypse, aka Doug Ramsey, aka Revelation. And the X virus is running rampant, and Philadelphia is quarantined. So it's a lot that's happening. And in today's issue, we start getting some of the pieces put together. And again, I think if you're a Doug Ramsey fan, there is payoff here that it has started since Heir of Apocalypse and gone through to now. But it does feel kind of left field that this is happening. Again, I don't want to fault the X Office or Jed McKay for using a story that was at this point a year and a half ago. But I think if this was just contained to McKay's run in the way that like Mike Carey contained Age of X for the most part. I know there were tie-in books. I know there were tie-in books. Again, not to the degree that we're getting it. But in Mike Carey's X-Men Legacy run, we got an Age of X. And that was very tight. Again, it was something that dealt with a story that Mike Carey was trying to tell. And perhaps time will prove me wrong. And we will be able to see that this just fits into McKay's arc and future arcs and what they have coming next for the X books. We know they're not relaunching. I said that, and CB, the editor in chief over at Marvel, he gave me some comments that where do you see that it's a relaunch? A new bring forward for mutant books in January. So I'm sure they're not relaunching with number ones, is what I'm saying. And we'll probably be able to see where Age of Revelations fits in the McKay run once everything is done. But this is being a big push for the fall. I mean, there are a million tie-in books. Everyone's saying you have to read these books. You know, this formula that Age of Apocalypse started back in the day, I think it worked in the 90s. It doesn't work anymore. It's a tired trope. I wish they would have gone more the Here Comes Tomorrow route with this, just to be very clear. And again, McKay probably came with a good idea and maybe editorial ran with it. I don't know. You know, Age of Apocalypse, House of X, Powers of 10, that was all because the writers, Scott Lobdell and Jonathan Hickman, wanted to tell larger grand stories, and Marvel editorial supported them in that. So perhaps that's the same thing here. Perhaps. Who knows? But anyways, so in the previous issue, in X-Men 22, when said moment where the handshake happens, Cyclops' mind is ripped from his body and is brought here to the present. And Cyclops in this issue wakes up disoriented and he's here like, what happened? And he's in a room surrounded by Magneto, Zorn, Angel, and he's really, really confused. And Magneto says, we brought your consciousness from 10 years ago into the body of your present day self, 10 years into your subjective future. And so Magneto goes on to explain to Cyclops that 10 years ago, Doug Ramsey, now better known as Revelation, joined the X-Men, the Heir of Apocalypse. His words can control the minds of those who hear them. He can speak even to cells of living things. Revelation joining the X-Men was the first step to what you see around you. And so what happened was 3K, which is the antagonist in the McKay series, unleash a virus that either transformed the people it infected into mutants or killed them outright. Some survived unscathed, but they soon found that the land itself had been changed and would no longer support them. The infection areas continue to slowly spread. Already it reaches far west as the Mississippi with no end in sight. Now, Cyclops says something to Magneto in this moment, which I thought was kind of insensitive. He goes, okay, it's a tragedy. My math puts it at millions. But what's this to be done about now? Because despite this, we see what's going on. This is the best situation for mutants since Krakoa. That to me is such a misstep of a line, right? And one that Cyclops, I don't believe, as someone who has seen Cyclops' growth from the 12 all the way through in Humans versus X-Men, I don't think Cyclops would ever say that. And I don't think the X-Men would ever stand for humans, millions of humans dying. But, the subject, and this is something that came up in the previous issue of X-Men 22, should the X-Men kill? We have a rebooted Beast, right? A Beast from pre-times. Let's say he's from the 80s, who's running around thanks to the Krakoan technology. And he tells Juggernaut, I can't believe you just killed someone in front of young mutants. And Juggernaut's like, why not? I should be able to kill, and I wouldn't think twice about it. So, the idea of should the X-Men kill or not is something that I think the books are posing, that Jed McKay is posing. In fairness, I know that's a very polarizing issue with fans. I don't think McKay is taking a side either way. I think McKay is posing it for the reader. And I think that's an interesting angle to explore. I personally just don't think Cyclops would ever say that. That seems a little off to me. But yeah, so Doug has these minions, and Topaz and Psylocke are among them, and Topaz is killed by Glob Herman. Very upsetting, because we love Topaz. But they're all trying to figure out how to stop Doug. And Doug is talking to Psylocke, and Psylocke's like, listen, the X-Men were well aware that we were in position, we were going to be there, and they killed Topaz. And there's this theory that there could be a leak among them. And the leak is Faye, Doug's wife. Now, I've never bought into the Doug Bay romance. It was something that happened during Ten of Swords. The biggest red flag I ever got in the X-Men franchise was that the promise of Krakoa was not going to go through when I read Ten of Swords. It was such a zany crossover. Such a zany crossover. And you can go back and listen to those episodes that we covered. Like, I can't believe it's been like 4 years, however long it's been. But Faye and Doug just kind of meet a couple panels, and Doug is like, wow, your eyes, I'm so in love with you. And then they get married. That's it. That's the romance. So I've never really bought the romance. I think at this point it's been a couple of years. Yay on them. But yeah, Ten of Swords, although it's a beautiful hardcover, if you have a chance to get the hardcover, it is gorgeous. It is really well done. And the editorial schedule, and told this to Jordan D. White, the then X-Men editor, when we had him on the podcast, I couldn't believe that their scheduling was great. Back in my day, kids, issues got delayed. Crossovers, were delayed because of editorial deadlines. It's fine. I mean, that's the thing of the past now. It seems that editorial deadlines everything happens very quick now. So Psylocke goes after Bay, and Psylocke leaves the body there. And Doug eventually comes to talk to her. And basically, Doug is doing something that is against protocols, and only Apocalypse will be able to decide what happens next. And so that's sort of what's happening here in this crossover. And the psychic transmission from Earth to Mars is about 34 minutes. But one of the things that kind of like threw me off with this is that Cyclops is like, what? What do you mean, Doug? It can't be Doug. And that just reads really odd to me, because of all people who have gone up against Apocalypse or Apocalypse-related villains, Cyclops should know that when you're under the influence of Apocalypse, anything goes. And it's a transformative experience because he went through it during the 12. He dealt with those issues during New X-Men. So the fact that he's here and he's the one to go up against Doug, I wish they would lean into that a little bit more. Again, one of the best things about the X-Men is that shared continuity, this complicated past that each of the characters have. And you would want to see some of that pay off. And it's sad when the writers don't really acknowledge that, or you don't have characters acting within a logical sphere of how they would sort of approach something. Like Cyclops shouldn't be this shocked that Doug is under Apocalypse's influence and is trying to carry out his mission. He should be like, damn, why didn't I do something? Of all the people who know what it's like to have Apocalypse in your head, I should be that person. We don't get that here. But what we do get, though, is we get the Angel of Death, and it's Wolverine. And of course, that is also a callback to the 12. And Wolverine kills Magneto, and Zorn is forced to take off his helmet. And we know that Zorn has a star for a brain, and it incinerates, presumably incinerates Wolverine, but Wolverine is seen to have survived. And also here is Beast. Beast also was taken from the past and brought to the future, and he's more in a white fur, kind of like how he was in Here Comes Tomorrow as well. And we found out too that Doug had wiped all language from Cyclops and Beast, and that they were just kind of like basically empty vessels. And so that's why they were able to bring in their past selves into these bodies. And presumably, going based off of logic, they don't really talk about it here, but their future selves are probably in those past bodies, maybe. I don't know. Either way, no one's going to be able to talk because they don't have language. And the issue ends with Faye dying at Doug's hands. So it's a strong start. It's a very strong start. And for anything that I was just kind of complaining about, I know the curse of being an X-Men fan, we're sort of nitpicking, but there's a lot of thought and there's a lot of world building here. And I think if you're enjoying Jed McKay's X-Men, this is something that's fitting in very nicely into that story. We're going to continue reviewing Age of Revelation here on the podcast. Let's see how things happen. I think Amazing X-Men #1 will be next on the read. I don't know if we're going to necessarily read and review like Laura Kinney's Sabretooth or Long Shots. I mean, I am going to read Long Shots or World of Revelation or Binary. Again, I think the crossover is getting away from editorial. I understand that they have to meet a certain amount of quota. You know, of course, Iron Frost looks really good. Who doesn't want to see Emma Frost in a dystopian future? I think of the Kris Jenner meme where it's Kris Jenner in like an apocalyptic situation. The caption reads, just finding a place for a Starbucks and to plug my iPhone in. But we'll see. You know, we get Cloak and Dagger, we get the X-Avengers, we get the Undeadpool, we even get Radioactive Spider-Man, we get Omega Kids, we get Sinister Six, we get a Rogue and Storm title. So it's a lot. They're pumping us full of a lot of books. I mean, more so than Age of Apocalypse. But the actual art and execution is beautiful. I mean, it's a very green dystopia. And again, they're all backs to Here Comes Tomorrow, especially with Doug just being more of a biblical enemy in the way that Beast was more of a biblical enemy. There's this idea of Days of Future Past floating through it. So we're okay with it. I am. I think this is really good. I think there is an element of paying off here. Again, I wish this was just something that Marvel editorial could have been like, what started in Heir of Apocalypse will now come to a conclusion or would be the next chapter. I do want to say, I think Doug in his villain era, I initially did not like the design for Revelation, but you know what? I kind of like Doug as a villain. I think this really works for the character. And again, this is to be the Dark Phoenix syndrome, where eventually he'll get his bearings and he'll have to rise above his evil programming. But this is really good storytelling for Doug, probably since Necrosha. I think in the Krakoan age, Doug had certainly a lot of seeds planted, especially in Inferno, but they never kind of came into fruition. So that's where we're at with Age of Revelation. We're about 3 issues in, or 4 issues. Well, let's see. The Heir of Apocalypse, that's an entire series. Age of Revelation issue 0, X-Men 22, and Age of Revelation Overture today. So that's 3 official issues plus a miniseries. But I will say, I think these first 3 issues have been sort of a false start. And in fairness, they have just been preludes, and I get it. But I'm ready for the story to start kicking off to see what the larger grand scope of everything's going to be. So I know the X-Men from the Ashes have been very tough. I have been very critical. I do think X-Men of Apocalypse, they love their ofs at Marvel. X-Men of Apocalypse, which is the Age of Apocalypse continuation, has been good. And I think Age of Revelation, which is the current 616 timeline's dystopian future, I think Age of Revelation is really good. I think these are 2 solid events that are happening now in the X books. I would say, again, oversaturated, but I believe Revort has said that, the scheduling has changed, and it's just how it happened. But I think they're worth picking up. I think Age of Revelation may be the harder one to get into because you do have to sort of read Heir of Apocalypse and X-Men 22 to really sort of understand what's going on and Jed McKay's vision. But it is worth picking up. So are you enjoying Age of Revelation so far? You can hit us up at Power of X-Men on Instagram. You can email us at paul@powerofxmen.com. We will be at New York Comic Con as much as I can. I have a lot of gigs. Longtime listeners know that this is my busy season, and I am forever cursed that when New York Comic Con comes around, it's my favorite con, and I always get booked up for it. So I'm going to try to be at New York Comic Con Saturday and Sunday. Sunday, I will be hosting another book reading with Lenore in the city, and you can hit us up at Power of X-Men on Instagram for the details there. Hit subscribe on this podcast. Leave a review should you want to. Let us know your feelings. That's the most important thing. Let us know your feelings about Age of Revelation. All right, Familia, we'll see you later.